Hello YouTube, my name is Emily. Today I'm bringing you the best books that I read in 2019. Overall, I had a pretty good reading year. I didn't feel like I was reading too many books to complete my Goodreads goal. I hit my goal of 70 books in 2019. And of course, I'm filming this video very late. This month has been absolutely crazy and I just haven't had time to film, edit, whatever. But now I thankfully have a period of peace to do these things. So I do have a top 10 list of best books that I read this year. I do also have 3 honorable mentions. These are books that didn't quite make it into my top 10 but were still quite notable, or maybe I read them a bunch of times before and didn't really want to include them in my top 10. So my first honorable mention is really 2 books. It's The Two Towers and The Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien. I did reread these books earlier in 2019. I've been wanting to do a reread of this trilogy for a long time. Of course, I've read these books a gajillion times before because of course this is my favorite trilogy. So I thought it was a little unfair to include them in my top 10, but I still wanted to pay my respects to them. This trilogy is like wine, it just gets better every time you read it. It was so formative in my life. So when talking about my reading year, I just didn't want to go without mentioning these books. My second honorable mention is Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. This is a very hyped book in the booktube world. This is about a man called Laszlo Strange, and he is fascinated by stories about a city called Weep. It's not been heard of for many, many years, so it's almost myth now. But one day he gets the opportunity to travel to the city of Weep, and when he gets there, he's able to uncover a lot of the mysteries around the city. This was a really well-written fantasy. I really loved the flowery language, and of course I loved the characters and the magic in the story. So it didn't quite crack my top 10 for me, but I still found this a very notable book. I'm really looking forward to the next book because apparently the love story develops a bit more in the next one. But yes, I was really glad that I read it last year. My third honorable mention is Light Magic for Dark Times by Lisa Marie Basile. So for those of you who haven't guessed from my interest in magic and the occult, I've been getting a lot more into magic in the past year and a half. I find it heavily therapeutic and empowering. I actually picked this book up when I was in Australia. It came highly recommended by a few podcasts that I listened to, and it was just a really nice, non-judgmental book of magic. It gives you a lot of ways for dealing with life crises, because people have this impression that you have to be positive all the time when you practice magic, when really that's not the case. Sometimes you are just not in a good place in your life. This was just a nice, gentle read, but with some really good substance in it. So one of my favorite books about magic that I read last year. So on to my top 10 books that I read in 2019. The first book I'm going to start with is A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. This is actually a reread, but I actually read it years before, so I don't think I even really absorbed the story that much when I first read it. And when I read it this time around, it's like I hadn't read the story at all. I realized just how much I'd actually forgotten about the plot and the characters and the magic system. And also I think I read it on audiobook and I think the narrator just didn't jive with me. This world and its characters are amazing. It's such a beautiful portrayal of magic, and it made me appreciate just how elegant V.E. Schwab's world building can be. Of course, this is the Barnes & Noble exclusive edition, so it has all kinds of really amazing art in the end papers. But this is an amazing book. I'm really hoping to get to the next 2 books in this series. And just generally, I want to read more V.E. Schwab. Next on my list is The Call by Peadar O'Gillen. In this book, Ireland has basically been taken over by fairies, and every teenager gets pulled into the fairy world for 3 minutes. And in those 3 minutes, they have to survive. And if they don't make it through those 3 minutes, horrible things happen to them. Fairies will hunt them and do unspeakable things to them. The main character is disabled from polio, so her survival odds are kind of bad. She's also looked down on by a lot of the other students who are more physically able. And I love seeing her growth over the course of this story. And of course, I loved this horrifying portrayal of fairies. I really love it when people pay homage to how scary fairies actually are. They are magical beings who do not think like humans, and they just have a mindset of their own. And of course, having a disabled main character makes for some really complicated exploration of this kind of survival story. But this was an amazing book. Highly recommend really looking forward to reading the next one. I am back a few hours later because my battery died. Let's continue. The next book on this list is Kafka on the Shore by Haruki Murakami. This is a very famous Japanese novel, and Murakami himself is a very premier Japanese author. This was definitely my first transition into his weirder works. The first novel I read of his, Norwegian Wood, was definitely the more grounded of his books. Kafka on the Shore is about a boy named Kafka who's on the run from his home. He's decided to leave behind his father and search for his mother, and the story follows the people that he meets along the way and how he learns from all of them. There's also a parallel storyline in the novel. It follows an illiterate man called Nakata. He is somewhat mentally disabled and he makes his living by helping to catch lost cats. So he and Kafka never quite meet, and yet their stories are interlinked. This book was amazingly well written. I'm not sure how it compares to the original Japanese, but it definitely evoked this very dream-like feeling. If you like a narrative where everything is straightforward and answers all of your questions, this is probably not the book for you. While I personally wanted to have a few more of my questions answered, I still overall really loved this book. It fulfilled my need for something weird and surreal to read. It really is about a boy who just needs to go through a Bildungsroman in order to have a fresh start with his life. But it was so great to spend more time with Murakami's amazing writing again. This was a really beautiful story. I'm not quite sure whether I read a story or somebody's dream, but I enjoyed it anyway. Next up is Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. I read this book I think back in 2016 or 2017, but I decided to reread it again just before the show came out. I had definitely forgotten a lot about this book. Basically, this is a comedic novel about the impending apocalypse and how a demon and this angel who have become friends over the years decide to stop the apocalypse and maybe save the Antichrist. This book is really witty and cleverly written. It really gave me a good taste of how Terry Pratchett can weave in comedy with fantasy. There were some sections with more horror in them, and they were very obviously Neil Gaiman sections. So this book is very obviously written by two different people. You can kind of see them fitting these differently written pieces together. It probably accounts for the narrative being a little bit rambly, but overall I really enjoyed it. I had so much fun reading it again, and it made it so much more rewarding to watch the show after I had the novel fresh in my mind. So next on my list is Dune Messiah by Frank Herbert. Dune Messiah is the second in Frank Herbert's Dune books. Among Dune fans, Dune Messiah is probably one of the less liked books because Dune follows Paul Atreides' rise to power, whereas Dune Messiah follows his downfall. And I guess a lot of people didn't really take a shine to seeing their very triumphant protagonist take a turn for the worse. But it personally really resonated with me because it's just the nature of things that what goes up must come down. I actually watched all of Comic Book Girl 19's Dune Club videos for this book, and because of that I think I was able to appreciate a lot of the themes present in this book. We got introduced to a whole different set of guilds and characters, and it is really sad. I did feel a lot of feels at the end of this book. This was definitely a sad but necessary part of Paul Atreides' arc. It's definitely a very understated but very good sequel. Next on my list are the first 3 volumes of the Saga of Swamp Thing by Alan Moore. I would say that I appreciated this series better when I did research on this series and then realized this is actually a continuation of a long overarching story arc of Swamp Thing that was a thing before Alan Moore came in. So basically Alan Moore was writing a continuation of an ongoing storyline, and I didn't know it before I went into the series, and now I feel dumb. And I only learned this after reading, what, the first 2 volumes of Swamp Thing? Nonetheless, now that I actually know what's going on, I like the series a lot. Swamp Thing is a set of comics in the DC universe, and the origin story of Swamp Thing is that a man called Alec Holland, he's a scientist, he dies in the swamp, and the swamp plant life basically acquires his consciousness. So basically he's a coagulation of plant life that is tricked into believing it's human. But that also means that he has a lot of really cool abilities because he's so integrated into nature. He can make things grow, he can regenerate his body in different places, he can move mountains if he wants. So a lot of the series has him confronting the fact that he's not actually human, but has all these godlike abilities. And definitely Volume 3 had a very satisfying moment where he leaned into his power and did something huge. And of course, Volume 3 also had the first introduction of John Constantine, who was very famously created by Alan Moore, and is also the main character of Hellblazer. But yeah, this was a very important 2019 read, and I'm really glad that I started the series. Next on my list is Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. You may know it for the movie with Sandra Bullock and Nicole Kidman that was based on this novel. The film, in my opinion, has not aged well. You should probably read the novel. But this book is about two sisters who grow up with their witch aunts. One sister is really flighty and has all kinds of relationships and wants to go all kinds of places, and the other sister really wants to have a normal life and stay at home and have nothing to do with magic. And they each kind of go their own ways away from their family roots, but eventually events bring them back together and force them to confront the magic in themselves. I really love this book. I always love good portrayals of witches in fiction. I really love the magical realism in this book. I love the lyrical writing. I love how poetically each of the sisters was described. And there wasn't a lot of dialogue, but you still got a good sense of each sister's characters just from the writing and how they were characterized and their actions. But yes, this book was such a joy to read, and there's actually a prequel out called The Rules of Magic, and I'm really looking forward to reading that. Next on my list is Two Dark Reigns by Kendar Blake. This is the third book in the Three Dark Crowns series, and of course Three Dark Crowns is one of my favorite series in the past decade. I think I mentioned this. The series surrounds an island queendom where in every generation the queen of the island gives birth to a set of triplets. And when they turn 16, these triplet girls will have to fight each other to the death. So of course this series surrounds three triplets and how they each deal with the burdens of the upcoming trials. There's all kinds of politics surrounding them, and of course a lot of magic. This is a political drama as well as a fantasy. So each of the sisters has to deal with a certain set of politics as well as harnessing their own powers. And I started out being a little bit worried about this book because it did start out slightly slow, but basically it was kind of like a Game of Thrones episode where everything is being set up and moved into the right place. And when everything rolled into action, I just couldn't put this book down. And this book also ended on a horrible cliffhanger, and everything is in chaos right now. And it really solidified what I really love about this series. And of course, I'm hoping to read the fourth and final book this year. Next up is Lair of Dreams by Libba Bray. I read this book in November for Tome Topple Readathon. This series surrounds a set of magically powered individuals called diviners. The main character is Evie O'Neill, and she has the ability to touch objects and know their history. She moves from Ohio to New York to avoid a scandal in her hometown, and she meets up with a group of friends in New York, some of whom also have some abilities of their own, and they deal with some of the supernatural happenings that occasionally plague the city. I love all the characters in this book. There's definitely a lot of racial and sexual diversity, but they also feel very real and concrete on the page. This book in particular deals with the Chinese community and the racism and discrimination they endure. I really love when Libba Bray pulls in a lot of the historical realities of the time, but it's not even in a really preachy way, the way some historical fiction can be. She just weaves it into the story and makes us believe it and accept it as a part of life. There's also some government conspiracies going on in this book, which make me very nervous for the next volume, but I really enjoyed this book. I am really enjoying this series. It is a real pleasure to read. It's always such a joy to find good historical fantasy. And finally on my list are The Wicked King and the Queen of Nothing by Holly Black. These are books 2 and 3 in the Folk of the Air trilogy. I read The Cruel Prince in November of 2018. I really enjoyed it. It was an amazing political thriller as well as a fantasy. I powered through it in less than 2 days, but somehow I never got around to reading Wicked King, even though it came out maybe a few months later. I think I bought this copy at Yelk because it was on sale for about £5, but I managed to read it this fall, and it was equally rip-roaring and twisty-turny. So of course I couldn't resist getting Queen of Nothing as soon as it came out. Now, taken as individual books, I would say that Wicked King is definitely better than Queen of Nothing. In fact, Cruel Prince and Wicked King are 5-star books for me, whereas Queen of Nothing is more of a 4-star book. But taken as a series together, it is a really great story. So this series is about a girl called Jude who is taken to live in the land of the fairies. Her foster father is a redcap who killed her parents and now has taken responsibility for her and her sisters. In the land of the fairies, she's very looked down upon because she's human and not fae. So she has an immense hunger to gain respect in this land. Eventually, she is recruited as a spy for one of the fairy princes, and that kickstarts her participation in the political happenings of this world. And one of the big bullies in her life is Prince Cardan, who is very complicated and mean and is generally a dick to her a lot. But over the course of the series, their relationship develops a lot. It even blossoms into something else. I love this series. I am very sad that it's over now because now there is no more Jude and Cardan. Or maybe there will be. I don't know if Holly Black is going to write more books in this world with these characters, but I really enjoyed this series. I was really glad I was able to complete this series last year. Definitely also one of my favorite series of the past few years. So that's it for my best books of 2019. Let me know down below what books you enjoyed reading last year. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram and Goodreads. Like this video if you liked it, and remember to subscribe to my channel if you like my content. And I will see you in my next video.